All right. I'll introduce myself. I'm Stuart. I'll teach it. Swinburne. There's an echo. I'm feeding back to myself. Anyway. I mainly to interior architect, and this subject. Oh no, Patrick, it's bad.
Take this out. I think the microphone might have to go. Is that all right? If everyone comes and sits up close. You can join the meeting. I have to invite you all. Just come sit close. It's cozy. Come and sit close, everyone. Everyone's coming to sit close. It's a long site, so we have a long we have people sitting in a long way at the moment, so now everyone come and sit in a flat way. So everyone at the back, if you just come up right up the front. Yeah, good. Good, I like it. Okay. If you can't hear at the moment, it means you are too far away, so you're welcome to come and sit right up here. Okay? Astrid, go for it. No, that's better. Okay. Oh no, there's still an echo, but I'll cope. All right. Look, I've pulled out. I teach CEPTD to interior architect. So you'll sort of have to interpret when I'm talking about hard built environment elements. Of course, you'll interpret that with your landscape architecture, vocabulary. So, this presentation is geared towards interior architects. And I've pulled out after talking to Patrick, basically the things that I think could actually guide you most with your site. And the first thing that Patrick and I spoke about was with your site was that there wasn't really a connection or a perceived connection, and that's something that your designs could enhance, this connection to that linear pipe. Next slide, Patrick. And from CEPTD, which stands for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design, there are a number of theorists and there are a number of aspects of it, but I think the one that will really guide you with this site is this notion of territoriality, which came from a theorist called Oscar Newman in the 1970s. And I'll just flick through. You've got to know where it comes from, but in not great depth. But a lot of CEPTD theory came out of the 1970s. Next slide, Patrick. When there was a backlash to orthodox modernism. And when Pruitt-Igoe, which is that bunch of buildings, was demolished, that's a lot of building, that's a lot of money to be demolished. People say that was actually the death knell of modernism. And what Oscar Newman did was, instead of imposing himself onto a situation, as architects are wanted to do, next slide, Patrick, at that time it was very radical for architects to actually say, let's not impose, let's actually go in there and ask people. How radical? Ask people what's going on. And what he found was that the top slide is these what they called sky streets, and people felt very, very unsafe in them because you literally opened your apartment door onto that sky street, and it felt like nobody owned these sky streets, and that's why the whole housing development failed, because architects imposed this idea rather than saying, well, actually what works. So from this study of why were these buildings demolished, why did modernism fail, he came up, next slide, Patrick. This was a famous book in the 1970s, Defensible Space, but it's this idea, actually we'll go straight into, of territoriality, that people feel safe. Here's a street in Melbourne. It could be in Surrey Hills. And I hear actually on your site, you've got a lot of backyards facing onto it. So it's the opposite of this, is what we call a soft edge. And people feel safe in space, in spaces that are places. And they feel safe in streets where they feel that the community has some sense of ownership. And from this slide, what you can see is that people, of course, they feel safe in their houses, they feel safe to inhabit these interstitial spaces, these front yards, and you know, they play there, they hang out there, they talk to their neighbours there, and then this feeling of safety and ownership then actually spills out onto the street. So it's this idea that for people to feel comfortable in spaces, they actually have to feel that they have a degree of ownership, some sort of a connection actually to it. So in your case, how do you build? How do you build this sense of connection? I mean, it could be a different relationship with the backyards, but there are other attributes of public spaces as well. So the other thing that Newman found out, next slide, is that Patrick, go back. A space really has to feel like a place, and you've got to have a connection to it in order to feel that you want to inhabit it. And proportion is really important. Does the space feel like a room and not a corridor, or not an overly linear space? So this is sort of, that ties into, a linear park is a great idea, but you actually want to divide that linear park actually into a series of public spaces or urban interiors, you know, and this is whether it's hard landscaping or planting, but to demarcate that space. So, you know, he says that for a place, a public space to be successful, you've got to have a connection, you've got to have safe spaces adjacent to it, and very importantly, are public and private spaces demarcated? Does the space have edges, borders? Is it defined? Very important, are entry and exit points defined? And does it feel like a room? Like, you don't want to feel like you are like a bullet in a gun being shot down this endless linear space. Next slide. And Newman's thoughts are also echoed by Christopher Alexander. Actually, there's a number of authors of this, and this is also very famous book of the 1970s, A Pattern Language, looks at why are pre-industrial spaces really successful in a way that sometimes our modern cities are not. And so these authors, all of them, it's like a historical survey. They looked at buildings and spaces through time, through history, and said, what characteristics do really successful spaces have? And just like Newman, next space, they said that people love, feel a connection to an identifiable neighbourhood. So the quote here is, people need an identifiable spatial unit to belong to. In simple terms, that really means, does this linear park feel like a place? Does it have a character that you can put your finger on? Oh, it's the beautiful green, you know, long green python. It's got to feel like it's something that it has a quality that you can identify. If you can't identify that quality, then you can't identify with it. And people love to belong to spaces, but you've got to give it that character. Next slide. These identifiable spaces also need boundaries, like a cell. Like a cell. If the cell wall isn't strong, then the cell doesn't exist. So your precinct, what sort of planting, what character, what aspect of the ecosystem, what do you bring forward? What is the character of the space that you're working with? So that's got to come forward, the character of the space. And also every time, next slide, the cell wall of that space, you've got to give that space recognisable boundaries and also create gateway conditions. Next slide. So I know this is medieval images. This is hard, this is architectural language, but through planting, through surfaces and materials, how do you demarcate a gateway? Because that's how human beings feel that they enter this precinct, you know, by creating some kind of a threshold condition. Next slide, more gateways. So how do you do that? How do you do that in a way and a visual language that actually speaks to the ecosystem and the character of the area, or even what the locals identify with? Then also what Christopher Alexander and co identified was, next slide, that successful cities all have promenades. So every subculture needs a place for its public life, a place where people are going to see and be seen, a place for the evening stroll. And I think that's kind of what's lacking. Nobody's really using it, and that can all be turned around. But a promenade has, you know, things that make it work. And in order to make it work, you've got to place activity nodes. There's got to be a reason why people go there. Obviously, at the moment, people don't feel they have a reason to go there. And what you've got to do is place activity nodes along it so that people go from node to node. Next slide. Activity node means that you just gather things together that people, you know, whether they're the drinking fountains, the amenities, the cafes, the food trucks, and these are all architectural examples, but in your design, these might be actually very, very heightened interfaces with nature. But you've got to have these heightened experiences that bring people there. There's no point scattering them there so that nobody sees them. They've got to be, it's like you're creating a pearl necklace. And each pearl is an experience along this promenade so that people will automatically walk from pearl to pearl. Next slide. So there are beautiful examples. Here's the Promenade Plantée. And you can sort of see that there's the green brings them, the pools bring them there, and that there are activities actually placed along this linear park. And the next one, the St Kilda Promenade, and what you can see is, and there are two characteristics of the promenade. It has a distinct character, that in this case it's a timber walkway, a distinct feel to it. And along it as well are these nodes. And what I really love about this, the site office example, is the way that the timber deck sort of, and I know you're not allowed to use timber in your site, but it's a detailing, that's a material question. But it's the way that that timber deck actually kicks up and becomes a bandstand. It then becomes more sheltered seating. There's a uniform language to it. So it's an identity. And this is where the necklace comes in. It is a necklace, but there are jewels and pearls along it, different activities actually along it that you can design. Next slide. And this brings us, this idea of the necklace brings us to, in CEPTD, what we also call wayfinding, that you actually have to design the journey. So not only do people want clear lines of sight, they want to see where they're going, but they also need landmarks. Next slide. And this comes from Kevin Lynch, the image of the city, who talks about the elements of the city that people identify: paths, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks. And we use those elements to orientate ourselves. So what that means is that when you've got a journey, once again, it's not this long, undifferentiated corridor. You punctuate that corridor with experiences, be they heightened interactions with the natural world or actually an activity, some sort of a program that you actually place there. So there are ways that you can sort of break up things by creating landmarks. Here we go, next slide. This is an interior space. You can see this would have been a really boring space. Long, you would have felt like in the barrel of a gun, but there are these movable elements within it that break it up and more relevant. Next slide. This is one of my students' projects. It was just a long linear walk actually in Swinburne on the campus, but you can see just the placement of these green walls punctuates that journey, breaks up that long, narrow pathway into perceptually what feels like a series of rooms. So you break up the journey, and you also place, next slide, elements. In this case, this element here changes, but there's, this is this idea of this consistent language that leads you through the landscape, and it changes, and sometimes it's an exhibition somewhere where things are exhibited, sometimes it's a place to rest, sometimes it's a place of shelter. But this element makes it very clear where this spine through the landscape exists. Another example, this is sort of a very overt modern language. Here we go, this pedibus in Florence. And this is actually a really lovely project, the idea that to get children to walk to school, they designed a walking school bus, so a route for children to walk, so that if everybody uses it, and this is sort of the idea in CEPTD, what makes spaces safe is you're wanting to actually create a spine through the site, a focus for everyone to come, and it's this thing of co-presence. People feel safest in the presence of other people. So you put things that appeal to them, and it's kind of like people come because people come because people come. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. So once again, like the necklace, there's a visual language that unites this spine, and then there are activities actually along it. Next slide.
Astra, just while we're there, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
I have noticed being on the site, if other people have noticed, that there's certainly a school on the site, and there's certainly, it's very flat, and there's, I've been there at a time of day where I see parents leading children around in sort of groups, and I thought, oh, pedibus.
Yes, pedibus. Yes, pedibus.
Applicable to certain sites of certain areas of our site, plus because it's got this wet, watery middle with very few crossings. I think there's such openings on this site to allow just school children to walk from east to west.
And see, that's another thing too. The greater pedestrians you have, you've got to turn me off again. The greater the amount of pedestrians, as opposed to car users, say for a whole precinct. You know, and so that's something. If you can make parents and that safety, parents feel safe to leave their children. That's like the ultimate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point of the site, and there's probably the high point ecologically of the site is right next to the school too. So which is also one of the high points of the exchange between salt and fresh water is all there. And I listened to you talk through this, and it just feels how you get more people through these sites and these sort of ecologically rich sites is perhaps the making of this whole corridor rather than a sense of we'll leave it to the ecology and the ecology will just do everything. I think there's a different way to have to think about it. It's almost like how to get more people in there may be a way to address this site.
And I guess this is ecology is really important. That's not my expertise. But that's where you can design these kind of, I call them interactions. Where you foreground you know, different ways of interaction. Play with water, noticing having visual connections. You know, you can design along this spine. Should we keep going?
Yep.
Oh, that's more of the petty bus.
It's a very good project to look at, the petty bus.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Yes. A consistent visual language. You know, that's the necklace, but punctuated along the way.
You know, it's an interesting concept along a it's a 5 kilometre long chain, and we've got about 34 students in the room doing various sections of it. Some overlapping with others, some the same. But, you know, I listen to you talking, it just feels like, oh, how do people begin a common language almost over the entire 5 kilometres, whether that would be at a council level, whether that would be sort of a strong CEPTD and sort of promenade way of thinking. That's an open thought.
Oh, look at this slide. In all of its architectural beauty, is just this idea of shelter people as much as possible. Elements, because CEPTD terms, what we're wanting to do is attract a really broad range of people. And if you're in a wheelchair, if you're pushing a pram, differently abled, etc., you're moving at a slower pace. So, you know, make sure that the vulnerable, the very, very old and the very, very young, that they are catered for because they're moving at a different pace. Make it comfortable. And of course, any element, and this can be a pergola, whatever it is, it can be a line of slightly larger vegetation sheltering you from prevailing winds. But once again, it's all part of this idea of the spine, that the promenade is something that is distinct. It's distinct outside of its surroundings, like a spine. Next.
So I'm going to cut in. Is it all right if I cut in like this?
Yeah, no.
I remember talking to you about this before, and on another site, this idea of having amenity for people. So, I mean, what I'd say on this 5 kilometre long site is, if any of you have a toilet block already existing on your site, a very easy next step, if I was at local council, a very easy next step is, how do you add amenity around that existing amenity like a toilet block? Because a toilet block is very popular with all ages. So rather than, like, often I feel in student projects, a toilet block that's existing gets completely never thought about. Yet it's already paid for, it's already built. Certainly anyone that's near the site with the small boat club, there's people that have electronic boats that they do out on part of this lake. There's already a toilet block that has just been renovated. For me, that would be a starting point of how else do you build out from that amenity? Because you are trying to attract people to amenity, shelter, these issues that Astrid is talking about.
And toilet block, barbecue, shelter, drinking fountain, places to lock your bike. And oh yeah, we go bike park. Just go to the next slide. Just this thing that when you're designing, try to separate where people walk from where people ride. You know, one path have a stone surface and gravel surface, or different things, because we want bikes, and that's right. But yes, demarcate for senses of safety when people are walking somewhere, because people quite often just go, oh, it's a linear park. Old people really, and people with prams, really hate those fast bikes whooshing and suddenly overtaking them. And we want bikes because, you know, that's the future. That's fantastic. It's far less energy. But, you know, if you can, in subtle ways, make paths for walking and a zone for riding, and kind of keep it consistent. And then, you know, that has a visual language that's then subtly different to where cars drive. We want people will drive there, that's a reality. We want people to ride there, that's what we would like. Walking, that's what we like the most, but actually give them their own zones and give them slightly different treatment so that you straight away know, you know, I'm here and I'm walking because this is where I'm meant to be. Next slide. And also this slide talks, these are all of Christopher Alexander's patterns of the successful attributes of the pre-industrial city. And what he states, and you can see here, it looks like a small Italian piazza. It's a question of proportion, that public squares are like public rooms, you know, that you feel very, very safe if you in a city feel that, you know, the civic spaces are like rooms, and to be very mindful that people like cozier ones. When they're too large, they feel deserted and emptiness feels awful. Next slide. And he just gives a recommendation, 14 to 18, 21 metres max. You know, if you can have these mini outdoor rooms, that there's sort of a certain coziness to them. If you can somehow have these as little jewels along these outdoor spaces, that would be lovely. Next slide.
That's very, very interesting in Scarborough Park. And I know when you walked along with Andrew, how that odd feeling of walking in the middle versus walking on the edge. You know, these ideas that Ashley's talking about are very, very applicable.
Yeah. Also, this pattern, so you can see the patterns have got numbers. The instinct to climb up from some high place and look down, survey your world, to be a fundamental instinct. So in these flat landscapes, is there some reason that you can have a ramp going up or some sort of vantage point? Because that's this thing of visual legibility. People like to walk up high and make sense of the landscape below. So I don't know, because I think, Patrick, you said it was a very flat landscape. So something like that could be one of the elements along this necklace. And then, of course, the next one, access to water. Well, of course, your site, it's all about water. And access to water is something that humans just fundamentally, you know, we were born in water, you know, amniotic fluid. We are 70% water. So to design with that, next slide, and particularly the one on the left I really like, you know, how can you place water in a landscape where, and I don't know, because Patrick spoke about these tides. Is there some way that you can make visually evident high tide mark, low tide mark, king tide mark, or even place water in the landscape in such a way that people can interact with it? So clearly this image on the left, no one's going to drown there, and yet on a hot summer's day, almost unsupervised, children can sort of really take delight with water in the landscape. Next. Oh, that's more more about water. And for most of you, that's this thing about sliding views. But I guess my earlier point was.
Astrid, sorry, we just missed that. It cut out. You said for most of you, there's a thing about views.
Oh yes, the views. What we normally think of, but we want to have visceral, tactile relationships with water as well.
Yeah, as opposed to just looking at it.
That's it. Next. Oh, I'm saying. Keep going, but yeah. So it's an Indian step well to do that, but some designers have really created these interactions with water, you know, which are just indescribably beautiful. I don't know what's possible on the site. But there are a few. Next slide. Preserve natural pools. Let streams from the natural barriers. And I think, Patrick, you mentioned that the streams are now engineered artifacts. So how can we neutralize them? Oh, look, and sorry. The last thing, I had to throw that in. There we go. Because it's this. And these are images. Once the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne, but I think the same. And the other's the Melbourne. The design tool. You can see the reflected in there. But it's this designed interaction, these sort of shallow pools where people can then really interact with these incredible creatures. Icky as they are. I mean, I love them. It's sort of a love repulsion thing. Anyway, that was it. These were the slides just that I picked out, but maybe, Patrick, some questions.
No, it's lovely eel finish there. Thank you for that. And this idea of designing for the eel and human interaction is a very nice one. Does anybody have any questions for Astrid?
I can't hear. I'm going to put my
You could hear. There were no questions.
Hang on a minute.
Okay, so in second year, there was a project you did using CEPTD principles. Do some of these principles that Astrid's talking about, are they the same? Can you see how they can be applied to this site, which I'm assuming is quite different to the second year site? Yeah. One question. Say it loud, and I'll repeat it to Astrid.
No, maybe if you, I can hear you, Patrick. If you get the question and
I love this question. I can hear the question in the question. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So the question is about a site that is particularly seen as ecological.
Yep.
For the eels
Yep.
and the ducks, etc., and people approaching it from that front. So how to incorporate humans more into that seems a difficult proposal. So they're somewhat backyard forgotten sites with things like horse floats in now. So and I think there's a certain slant for many people to how do we just restore it to some ecological cleaner water, etc., etc. And I think when we, maybe we can all answer this question together, because I think the question is, do we even bring people in there? Yeah, that's sort of the question, isn't it? Oh, I've certainly got an answer to that. Astrid, do you want to go first?
No, you start. You start. I think I've got one, but I'll.
I mean, I would say it is an urban environment. There's people living everywhere, like literally meters away. I would say absolutely. So I don't think that corridor needs to be zoned off as a reserve and closed off. I think there's more nuanced ways to answer this. So I would say potentially it's closed off at night. Potentially it's not lit. And let's have a lighting conversation.
Oh yes, indeed.
There are moments in this 5-kilometre long corridor that are not lit, and they do not invite people at night. And the ecology wins. Hooray!
Right.
perhaps there are, in the day, there is much more sense of exposure to the local people who have no idea that it's even there at the moment, or care. There's no care, right? There's no care from local people. So how do you encourage care? And I think these principles Ash was talking about are exactly right. And so they include things like comfortable ways to walk through, separate bike paths, separate walk paths, a toilet block, like all these like a 21-metre-ish kind of space is kind of comfortable for people. So that's different than just how do we cross an ecological piece of water in the most ecologically gentle way. Like, I think it's a very different approach. And what we see, whatever's happening now is not working.
Right. Can I turn me off a little ramble and not listen to you again?
I think I've stopped anything.
I'm on, I think.
Yep, you're on. You're on. Go.
Am I on?
You're on. And I'm sideways.
Oh, that's okay. Oh, it's all fun and games. I think, and here we come to an interface between architecture, landscape, let's call it anthropogenic design, and we'll call it then interspecies or nature-based design. Do you know what I mean? How do we do that? Can you hear me, Patrick?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I think from CEPTD, because that's definitely it's anthropogenic design. We're asking what makes humans feel comfortable. From CEPTD, what it seems to be is that, or what I'm suggesting with the idea of a corridor, is that humans love the co-presence of other humans to feel safe. That's kind of a nice thing for ecology, because I guess I'm saying that through this long site, you know, this zone that we call anthropogenic might only be 2 meters wide. You know, that leaves 30, 40 meters either side that you then hand over to ecology. So what I'm saying is that this spine, that people feel safe walking along there because there are other people there. It draws people there because people come if they feel safe. People go, yes, little Patrick, you can walk home along there because it's safe. So there's that kind of experience of urban co-presence that might be this path. But then there's this experience with nature, let's say of wildness, of, I don't know, experiencing nature on its own terms. And then you have that choice to step off that well-worn path and deviate from it as far as you like, and then, the minute you step off that path, then suddenly ecological values take precedence. I don't know if this is the answer that we're grappling with, because humans sort of want one thing, which is co-presence, and then there are zones where we want those ecological values to be appreciated in their own right. And actually, if you kind of do both things, that you understand here is this zone for humans. They're here, that's why they feel safe. That's why there's a lot of them working there. And I know this is the argument for zoos. You sort of have to immerse people in natural environments for them to care about them. You know, you can't have a relationship with something that you don't know about. You've got to bring them there in the first place. But you can kind of in your schemes imagine that, yes, there are these hard landscaping elements that you bring all that CEPTD promenade interspersed with activities and amenities along it. But then once you're off the path, then ecological values then, you know, dominate. And these are these intense experiences, be it views, be it that you see eels, be it that there is spectacular Moreton Bay figs or what have you, that there are these natural interactions. But I think you've kind of, the project is almost two projects. This zone for humans that brings them there, and then these intense, once you leave that spine, these intense interactions with nature where as a designer, you let ecology rule, and in fact, you celebrate ecology, and you perhaps celebrate water. You make it very explicit. You have tidal pools that go up and down at just the right level so that you can see the eels, and the pool fills up at king tide and then it doesn't. There are ways to accentuate what's already there, but you've actually got to do both this anthropogenic design and interspecies design. Patrick, is that the answer?
That's lovely. I like that answer. Astrid, the other day we spoke about the dual system of thinking, wet and dry, and I realised in the aspect proposal, aspect of done about this question, there are several path systems.
You're dropping in and out, Patrick.
Sorry, the other day you talked about a dual system.
That's right, and I think that's what it is. If you just say ecological principles rule, that's beautiful, but there will be this beautiful ecology that's celebrated by no one. so I think you can sort of, with your project, say I'm actually doing both, and some elements will be serving one, some elements will be serving the other, and I think for each of you that will be different, your approach will be different, but you are actually having to address both, really.
Because I think history shows if you don't, it gets dumped upon.
Well, look, it's a sad thing. We humans need that, our itches scratched, and then we come there and we care, and then the dumping doesn't happen because things are only dumped where there's no human surveillance. That's another CEPTD thing, actually.
Yeah.
And in fact, whenever things are dumped, that's normally places where people feel unsafe. Things dumped communicates non-safety because, hey, if they don't care, why should I care? And non-care is a contagious state of mind. Whereas if you design and show care, I care for you. Here's shelter, here's planting that intercepts the prevailing winds, here's water, here is amenities, here's an outdoor movie screen, here are these things that care. We all come, we all care, and care is contagious in the positive. And that's right, we should also, part of CEPTD is also lighting as well. And lighting, is it time for the lighting chat? It is,
yes,
isn't it?
Have a quick lighting chat.
Quick lighting chat. So, of course, lighting at night time is really, really important because that's actually when humans' tolerance for non-safety is at its greatest, particularly women. And of course, if you're designing lighting, you've really got to be very, very careful not to create light pollution. Light pollution being light that stops all nocturnal creatures with their circadian rhythms it disrupts their circadian rhythms. So with CEPTD, what we do know is that people don't necessarily like really bright light. People think, oh, it's got to be really, really bright, then people will feel safe. That's not necessarily true because when you've got very, very bright street lights, the classic bright street light, what you get when you enter a very bright street light is the minute you're outside of that cone of light is you get a very steep drop off, and the retina of your eye has to actually adjust from that bright LED urban light and then the darkness. And you sort of perceive that people don't like that drop off. They would prefer a lower level of consistent lighting. And at nighttime, what's really, really important, so it's consistency and also wayfinding. And so what you're really wanting with wayfinding lighting is actually, it's better to have a much, much lower level of light actually lighting up whenever there's a changing gradient, like a step or a ramp or the edge of a path, but much, much, much lower lighting closer to the ground so that you can actually see where you can walk. You know, the last thing that you want is just light being sprayed into the atmosphere. That's not great for nocturnal creatures, and it's not necessarily good for CEPTD, because what we actually prefer is lighting as wayfinding. So, you know, that's where you put the light. It's actually better as wayfinding at foot level, lighting up where you're walking. And it's also the color of the lighting as well. So somewhere, I forgot to do that slide. I can send it to Patrick. There's just research, a team of Dutch researchers found out that actually it's, because all light sources have got what's called a color temperature, and that lighting in the warmer range is less disruptive than in the cold range. And a lot of new LEDs, because they're cheap and they're so efficient, everyone put these hyper bright white, but it's in the blue spectrum. And that is the worst for nocturnal creatures because it's most like daylight. Whereas lighting, and with LEDs, remember, you can tweak them to be whatever color temperature you like. So this is something that a lighting designer does, and in a big professional practice, you would actually have lighting consultants. But you've really got to specify, look, we're wanting in the warm color temperature, and that is less disruptive because it is more like dusk and dawn in the warmer, lighting in the warmer tones. Now, the great thing is this also overlaps with CEPTD as well, because people prefer warmer tone lighting than cold. So, you know, hey, happy win. For once, what's good for humans is also good for creatures. Win-win. Don't you love it?
That's good. Good. Does that answer that question?
we just went on our own tangent, didn't we, Patrick?
Astrid, we began tangenting the other way about wet and dry, and the possibility of having a little conversation around materials that can be like inundation landscape materials. Certainly, the landscape architect from the council told us that we hate timber decks. They're terrible for long-term maintenance for council. People or landscape architects often put them forward. I've certainly put them forward in public projects I've done, and then 20 years later realised they needed to be redone. Like, it is quite interesting. So I'd love with you here on screen, because I know various shades of Astrid, and there's other hats of Astrid that are material specialist. So I'd love to have this conversation with you actually about what I'd call inundation landscape materials.
Well, it's true. In the images for a promenade, even I showed a timber deck, and I think that comes from timber piers. Do you know what I mean? Yes. And that seaside architecture. So, there's a precedent for it. But it is true. If the landscape's going to be inundated, and, I've sort of said that this spine has to have this consistent, when I say visual language, it's, a vocabulary of materials, that you're going to use. The obvious one is that plastic, the recycled plastic materials, which actually they mimic timber. So I don't know. Is that,
that's, I did a quick Google, and there's a whole range of brands along the reconstituted and recycled plastic.
And it's kind of neat because it's recycled. That's visual sustainability. But do you feel that there's kind of a bit of an untruth because it's trying to be a something else?
Oh, no, I don't. And I think I was in Noosa not so long ago, and they have spent a big dollar on a lovely reconstituted plastic, quote unquote, timber boardwalk.
Right.
About 3 years ago, because they've had to replace their old timber boardwalk. And it looks terrific. And it's going to last about 800 years because it's plastic.
But I think then the thing, and I think I spoke to you about that earlier, when you're using materials kind of like plastic, and this goes whether it's plastic pretending to be a boardwalk or let's say if you're using marine plywood instead of solid timber, all these materials, how you deal with the edges determines whether it looks cheap and nasty or not. So, is the handrail a lovely, lovely, fine welded piece, or is it something big and clumpy? How can you perhaps put a sexy little steel metal angle on the edge of the plastic, and it'll make it look, incredibly minimal rather than clunky? Can you cantilever that plastic over something? So so plastic, as long as you use recycled plastic, as long as you deal thoughtfully with the edges, is fantastic. The other solution, of course, are the gabion construction. That's those little rocks in baskets. Well, they're fantastic because it's cheap. They're little rocks, not big slabs. And they're not going to go anywhere because they're in their little baskets. It comes from an old form of making bridges before they knew how to cast concrete underwater. That's where gabion, I think it's French, gabion construction. So gabions are good. And of course, so is stone. And if you're, of course, going to use stone, then, of course, you're going to say local to what? Not just for embodied energy, but when you're using any natural material, if you can make it kind of local, or that it speaks to the local, what the soil looks like, what the local stone is, it really enforces this rather than taking away from this sense of place. I mean, the last thing you do is go, oh, travertine marble from Italy. It would be nonsensical. But so if you're going to use stone, because clearly stone will last, it can be gabion, there might be some kind of paving, but really do your research. Local to what? Local to where? What's the embodied energy? Getting it there. There we go. There are the options. And of course, concrete, that's a tricky one. That's a question of detailing. I think Patrick showed me images, and there was far too much utilitarian concrete, meaning concrete, just made everything look like it was a drain.
That's not a lot of drains there.
A lot of drains, but there are, beautiful ways, particularly precast concrete, because you can give it fantastic finishes. You can add colour to it so that it's a sandy colour or black or whatever it is. Thoughtful use of high quality concrete might be something else, that you're going to go, okay, there's concrete, but it's different. I suppose that those would be my choices in a landscape that's inundated.
Hey, that's good. While we've got you here, because this site has this other, uniqueness. You say the word stone, and I think, it could last for 200 years. Well, science is telling us pretty much this site is going to be underwater by that time. So when I think, what does that mean for material choices? Like, there may be some material choices from all of you that are about removability or dissolvability or ability to readdress it in 40 years. Like, it's done in compartments or sections, and this will be picked up and moved. Like, I think this site requires adaptability, safety to fail, because the water's coming in higher every couple of years.
Yeah, these are built environment answers. But things, a roll call. One would be pontoon structures, because remember, pontoon structures rise and fall to whatever the tide is doing, and it all changes. You move them away. So could some sort of a pontoon, and the great thing about pontoon, so that's basically some sort of encapsulated air. Cheap versions of it are just 44-gallon drums strapped underneath something. Houseboats, it's like houseboat construction. That can actually rise and fall with the tide in real time, but they can also be moved across the site. Very, very light steel structures can also be moved because they're so strong and they're so light. But then another solution as well is something called a blue roof. I think I mentioned that to you. And so this idea that you design, because the problem is you've got these rain bomb events. The rain bomb hits, all the water goes off. And so what you do, so whether it's a blue roof, which is designed to hold the water and then let it go slowly. So whether it's a blue roof or whether you actually even have retention ponds, this is where the pictures of the eels, that you design parts of the landscape to discharge. It's like a dual design. Again, another, dual design. Parts of the landscape discharge quickly, and they then the water has to leave, and then you let other parts of the landscape actually hold the water, because what you're wanting in that rain event is that not all the water at once is drained. You're trying some parts of it to hold on to it, and that's where a blue roof, you can Google it, it's the same as a green roof, but where in a green roof it's designed to discharge the water very quickly, because it's an engineering problem. If you've got water on a roof, it's heavy. Water is heavy. So, there are engineering solutions. It's a much stronger structure. but you design a green roof either to discharge water, or in the case of a blue roof, to hold water, or you have a series of holding ponds. And the idea of that is quite nice, because you design the landscape to be inundated. You sort of, there's a dual approach to the landscape, so I guess sections of it, actually there's three sections of it with the human infrastructure are elevated, or steel, because you don't want to move it, elevated or portable. That's one part of it. Part of it is sort of the natural drain or the natural water courses. And then a third part might be these blue roofs on some of the infrastructure, or retention ponds full of eels that you place there for people to interact with water. The water is being retained, so they record what's going on in the landscape, but they also hold that water so that the rain bomb might be half a rain bomb. Rain bombs away, but the other half is still sitting somewhere that you've designed for it, so that it's held there. That first bit of water drains away, and then the rainwater sort of slowly is let go. Well, it is like replicating a wetland, actually.
Yeah, it is. It is. I'm aware of the time. If anybody's got any other comments or questions, now is the time for them. None?
None.
We're going to have to love you and leave you and say thank you, so we might give you a little round of applause.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Astrid. We will consider everything you've said.
Okay, and I look forward to seeing the results at some stage. Boom, boom.
Boom, boom. I like it.
Boom, boom.
Okay. Bye.
Okay, ciao.
Bye.